Good morning, folks. Hi, everybody. Normally, when I come on here to read, I read one of my books, but given the current state of everything, today I'm going to read from White Trash, the 400-year untold history of class in America. I put classism on the intro, and that was an error on my part. So, anyway, let's see, what does the book say about the author? First, I want to know, what are her qualifications? All right. Have you heard of this book before? I don't know. Anyway, here we go. One of the most memorable films of all time is To Kill a Mockingbird, 1962. A classic portrait of the legacy of slavery and racial segregation in the South. It is a film that I have been teaching for over 2 decades and is one of President Obama's favorite movies. Oh, let me see here. When was this published? Preface to the paperback. Let's see here. I guess this was... What? Oh, here we go. Nancy Eisenberg is the T. Harry Williams Professor of American History at Louisiana State University and the author of the New York Times bestseller, White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America, and 2 award-winning books, Fallen Founder, The Life of Aaron Burr, and Sex and Citizenship in Antebellum America. She is the co-author of with Andrew Burstein of The Problem of Democracy and Madison and Jefferson. So, that's who the author is. Preface to the paperback edition. This book was originally published in the middle of the contentious 2016 presidential election season. By describing historical patterns, it had the effect of bringing some clarity to the otherwise feverish rhetorical middle. And yet, in the aftermath of the election, conventional wisdom did little to improve upon the pre-election confusion. Okay, I'm going to skip all that. Oh, God. You're talking about Republicans and Democrats, and honestly, I don't. That's not... Here we go. I'm just going to go back to this. All right. Yet, when my students watch this film, even if they were exposed to it in high school, they see for the first time that the drama within has not one but 2 disturbing messages. One plotline is about the brave, principled lawyer, Atticus Finch, who refuses to perpetuate the racial double standards. Despite opposition, he agrees to defend an African-American, Tom Robinson, on the charge of raping a poor white girl, Mayella Ewell. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Though the court finds Robinson guilty, we the viewers know he is innocent. An honorable, hard-working family man, he stands well above the degraded Ewells, his accusers. The shabbily attired Mayella is cowed by her bully of a father, and a scrawny man seen in overalls who is devoid of merit or morality. Bob Ewell demands that the all-white jury of common men take his side, which they do. In the end, he insists that they help him avenge his daughter's honor. Not satisfied when Robinson is killed trying to escape from prison, he attacks Atticus Finch's 2 children on Halloween night. Bob Ewell's full name is Robert E. Lee Ewell, but he is not an heir of one of the aristocratic families of the South. As Harper Lee described them in the novel from which the classic film was adapted, the Ewells were members of the terminally poor, those whose status could not be lifted or debased by an economic fluctuation, not even the Depression. They were human waste. In the author's words, no truant officers could keep their numerous offspring in school. No public health officer could free them from congenital defects, various worms, and diseases indigenous to filthy surroundings. They lived behind the town dump, which they combed every day. Their run-down shack was once a Negro cabin. Garbage was strewn everywhere, making the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. No one in the neighborhood knew how many children lived there. Some thought 9, others 6. To the town of Maycomb, Alabama, the Ewell children were simply dirty-faced ones at the windows when anyone passed. The Ewells are unmistakably what Southerners and a lot of other people call white trash. Americans today have a narrow and skewed understanding of white trash. One of the most powerful and most familiar symbols of backward attitudes associated with this unfavored group is that captured in newspapers and in television footage of 1957, showing the angry white faces of protest amid school integration in Little Rock, Arkansas. In 2015, tattooed KKK protesters defending the Confederate flag outside Columbia, South Carolina State House evoked similar feelings, demonstrating the persistence of an embarrassing social phenomenon. The stock of the Food Network's popular performer Paula Deen, a Georgia native, for her cholesterol-rich recipes, suddenly took a nosedive in 2013 when it was revealed she used the N-word. Almost overnight, her down-home reputation sank, and she was rebranded as a crude, unsophisticated redneck. At the other extreme, television viewers have been treated to such repackaged vaudeville characters such as Jefferson Davis Boss Hogg in The Dukes of Hazzard's 1979-85, which could be seen in reruns until 2015, when it was dropped because the Confederate flag painted on Bo and Duke's car General Lee. The very title of this show was a pun on class identity, since the Dukes are poor Georgia mountain folk and moonshiners, yet their name implies English royalty. These white trash snapshots offer an incomplete picture of a problem that is actually quite old and regularly goes unrecognized. In their conversations about viral events such as those noted above, Americans lack any deeper appreciation of class. Beyond white anger and ignorance is a far more complicated history of class identity that dates back to America's colonial period and British notions of poverty. In many ways, our class system has hinged on the evolving political rationales used to dismiss or demonize, or occasionally reclaim, those white rural outcasts seemingly incapable of becoming part of the mainstream society. The Ewells, then, are not bit players in our country's history. Their history starts in the 1500s, not the 1900s. It derives from British colonial policies dedicated to resettling the poor, decisions that conditioned American notions of class and left a permanent imprint. First known as waste people and later white trash, marginalized Americans were stigmatized for their inability to be productive, to own property, or to produce healthy and upwardly mobile children, the sense of uplift on which the American dream is predicated. The American solution to poverty and social backwardness was not what we might expect. Well into the 20th century, expulsion and even sterilization sounded rational to those who wished to reduce the burden of loser people on the larger economy. In Americans' evolving attitudes towards these unwanted peoples, perhaps the most dramatic language attached to the mid-19th century, when poor rural whites were categorized as somehow less than white, their yellowish skin and diseased and decrepit children marking them as a strange breed apart. The words waste and trash are crucial to any understanding of this powerful and enduring vocabulary. Throughout its history, the United States has always had a class system. It is not only directed by the top 1% and supported by a contented middle class. We can no longer ignore the stagnant, expendable bottom layers of society in explaining the national identity. The poor, the waste, the rubbish, as they are variously labeled, have stood front and center during America's most formative political contests. During colonial settlement, they were useful pawns, as well as rebellious troublemakers, a pattern that persisted amid mass migration of landless squatters westward across the continent. Southern poor whites figured prominently in the rise of Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party, and in the atmosphere of distrust that caused bad blood to percolate among the poorer classes within the Confederacy during the Civil War. White trash were dangerous outliers in their efforts to rebuild the Union during Reconstruction, and in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, when the eugenics movement flourished, they were the class of degenerates targeted for sterilization. On the flip side, poor whites were the beneficiaries of rehabilitative efforts during the New Deal and in LBJ's Great Society. At all times, white trash remind us of one of American nation's uncomfortable truths: the poor are always with us. A preoccupation with penalizing poor whites reveals an uneasy tension between what Americans are taught to think the country promises, the dream of upward mobility, and the less appealing truth that class barriers almost invariably make that dream unattainable. And this is really, really important, this part right here. A preoccupation with penalizing poor whites reveals an uneasy tension between what Americans are taught to think the country promises, the dream of upward mobility, and the less appealing truth that class barriers almost invariably make the dream unobtainable. Of course, the intersection of race and class remains an undeniable part of the overall story. The study presented here reveals a complicated legacy. It's not just a question of labeling the bottom at any given time. Rationalizing economic inequality has been an unconscious part of the national credo. Poverty has been naturalized, often seen as something beyond human control. By this measure, poor whites had to be classified as a distinct breed. In other words, breeding was not about the cultivation of social manners or skills, but something far more sinister, an imposed inheritance. The language of class that America embraced played off English attitudes towards vagrancy and marked a transatlantic fixation with animal husbandry, demography, and pedigree. The poor were not only described as waste, but as inferior animal stocks too. Over the years, populist themes have emerged alongside more familiar derogatory images, but never with enough force to diminish the hostility projected onto impoverished rural whites. We have seen in recent decades the rise of tribal passion through the rediscovery of redneck roots, a proud movement that coursed through the 1980s and 1990s. More than a reaction to progressive change in race relations, this shift was spurred on by a larger fascination with identity politics. Roots implied that class took on the traits and allure of an ethnic heritage, which in turn reflected the modern desire to measure class as merely a cultural phenomena. But as evidence in popularity of the reality TV show Duck's Dynasty and Here Comes Honey Boo Boo in recent years, white trash in the 21st century remains fraught with older baggage of stereotypes of the hopelessly ill-bred. A host of well-known and lesser-known figures contributed to the long saga of America's embattled lowly breed. These included Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Davy Crockett, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Jefferson Davis, Andrew Johnson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Theodore Roosevelt, Erskine Caldwell, James Agee, Elvis Presley, Lyndon Baines Johnson, James Dickey, Billy Carter, Dolly Parton, William Jefferson Clinton, and Sarah Palin, to name a few. Examining their ideas, shifting public images, and self-images helps us to make greater sense of the curious and complicated story of American class identity. This book tells many stories then. One is the importance of American rural past. Another, and arguably the most important, is one we as a people have trouble embracing through the pervasiveness of a class hierarchy in the United States. It begins and ends with the concepts of land and property ownership. Class identity and the material and metaphoric meaning of land are closely connected. For much of American history, the worst classes were seen as extrusions of the land, scrubby, barren, and swampy wasteland. Home ownership remains today the measure of social mobility. My interest in this topic goes back to graduate school, where I was fortunate to have worked with two remarkable scholars whose approach to history shaped my professional career in significant ways. Gerda Lerner, my doctoral dissertation advisor, had a keen passion for demystifying ideologies, and she instilled in me a wariness for the limits of conventional wisdom. Paul Boyer was an intellectual historian with an amazing range, who wrote with subtlety and grace about Puritan New England, 19th century moral reformers, and 20th century religious fundamentalists. The border town of San Benito, Texas, figures into my interest in this topic as well. It was my mother's birthplace. Her father... Oh, the dog is moving this. Stop it, Muddy. Thank you. Okay, let's see here. Anyway, hi. I'm reading from this book of history. It is not fiction. So, anyway, I was reading the preface because it kind of talks about why the author was interested in this, but I'm going to just skip to the beginning. We know what class is, or we think we do. Economic stratification created by wealth and privilege. The problem is that popular American history is most commonly told, dramatized, without much reference to the existence of social classes. It is as though, in separating from Great Britain, the United States somehow magically escaped the bonds of class and derived a higher consciousness of enriched possibility. After all, the U.S. Senate is not the House of Lords. Schoolbooks teach the national narrative along the lines of how land and liberty were won and how ordinary folks seized opportunity. The hallowed American dream is the gold standard by which politicians and voters alike are meant to measure quality of life, as generations pursue its own definitions of happiness unfettered by the restraints of birth, who your parents are, or station, the position you start out from in the class system. Our cherished myths are at once bolstering and debilitating. All men are created equal was successfully employed as a motto to define the promise of America's open spaces and a united people's moral self-regard in distinguishing themselves from a host of hopeless societies abroad. The idea of America was presented by its chief promoters with great panache, a vision of how a modern republic might prove itself revolutionary in terms of social mobility in a world dominated by monarchy and fixed aristocracy. All that is bolstering. However, the reality on the ground was and is considerably different. In the most literal terms, as we shall see, British colonists promoted a dual agenda. One involved reducing poverty back in England, and the other called for transporting the idle and unproductive to the New World. Let's see here. After settlement, colonial outposts exploited their unfree laborers, indentured servants, slaves, and children, and saw such expendable classes as human waste. The poor, the waste, did not disappear, and by the early 18th century they were seen as a permanent breed. This way of classifying human failure took hold in the United States. Every era in the continent's vaulted developmental history had its own taxonomy of waste people, unwanted and unsalvageable. Each era had its own means of distancing its version of white trash from the mainstream ideal. By thinking of the lower classes as incurable, irreparable breeds, this study reframes the relationship of race and class. Class had its own singular and powerful dynamic, apart from its intersection with race. It starts with the rich and potent meaning that came from the different names given the American underclass. Long before today's trailer trash and rednecks, they were called lubbers and rubbish and clay eaters and crackers. And that's just scratching the surface. Lest the reader misconstrue the book's purpose, I want to make the point unambiguously by reevaluating the American historical experience in class terms. I expose what is too often ignored about American identity. But I'm not just pointing out what we've gotten wrong with the past. I also want to make it possible to better appreciate the gnawing contradictions that are still present in modern American society. How does a culture that prizes equality of opportunity explain or indeed accommodate its persistently marginalized people? 21st century Americans need to confront this enduring conundrum. Let us recognize the existence of our own underclass. It has been with us since first European settlers arrived on these shores. It is not an insignificant part of the vast national demographic today. The puzzle of how white trash embodied this tension is one of the key questions the book presumes to answer. America's class language and thinking began with the forceful imprint left by English colonization. The generations of the 1500s and 1600s that first envisioned the broad-scale English exploitation of America's natural environment employed a vocabulary that was a mix of purposeful description and raw imagery. They did not indulge in pretty talk. The idea of settlement had to be sold to wary investors. The planting of the New World colonies had to serve Old World purposes. In grand fashion, promoters imagined America not as an Eden of opportunity, but as a giant rubbish heap that could be transformed into productive terrain. Expendable people, waste people, would be unloaded from England. Their labor would germinate a distant wasteland. Harsh as it sounds, the idle poor dregs of society were sent thither simply to throw down manure and die in a vacuous muck. Before it became that fabled city upon a hill, America was, in the eyes of the 16th century adventurers, a foul, weedy wilderness, a sinkhole, suited to ill-bred commoners. Dark images of the New World accompanied more seductive ones. When early English promoters portrayed North America as a rich and fertile landscape, they grossly and perhaps knowingly exaggerated. Most were describing a land they had never seen, of course. Wary investors and state officials had to be convinced to take the plunge into a risky overseas venture. But most important, it was a place in which they could export their own marginalized people. The idea of America as the world's best hope came much later. Historic memory has camouflaged the less noble origins of the land of free and home of the brave. We all know what imagery springs to mind and when patriots of our day seek confirmation that their country is and was always an exceptional place. Modest pilgrims taught to plant by generous Indians, Virginia Cavaliers entertaining guests at their refined estates along the James River because of how history is taught. Americans tend to associate Plymouth and Jamestown with cooperation rather than class division. And it gets ever more misty-eyed from there because disorder and discord serve no positive purpose in burgeoning national pride. Class is the most outstanding, if routinely overlooked element in presuppositions about early settlement. Even now, the notion of a broad and supple middle class functions as a mighty bomb, a smokescreen. We cling to the comfort of the middle class, forgetting that there can't be a middle class without a lower. This is so important. And this is what really, and I'm going to go off on a tangent here and tell me what you think about this. I really want to hear what other people think. But all these political parties that are saying they want to save our country for the middle class, it really hits hard because if there is a middle class, that means there is a lower class. And as long as we're protecting the middle class, we are not for equality. Period. It's a lie. All the middle class people out there that are touting for equality aren't willing to take all the steps it takes to actually see equality happen in this country, because if they did, they wouldn't be defending their middle class status. It's about classism. Anyway, that's my tirade. I'm going to go back to reading. If you like this, if you want to learn about it, this is written by a scholar. White Trash, the 400-year Untold History of Class in America. And obviously I can't read the whole book today, but getting into the thick of it, once you get in here, she really takes the time to outline and explain in thorough detail how racism, specifically black and white, is an American-made construction. There was discrimination based on classism and pigmentation in the rest of the world before America was a country. However, they didn't call it black and white. That is something that we made up here to divide our lower classes so they wouldn't band together to demand equality. This is an age-old tradition that the racism, the brand of racism that exists in the world right now is American made, and it was American made specifically for the purpose of upholding classism, because the upper class wanted to make sure that classism still existed so that they would keep their power. Anyway, so this book is really, really helpful. If you are white and you want to better understand and deconstruct the systemic racism that currently exists in this country and keep an open mind and still be able to grow as a person, then it helps to understand the history of how that system was created. It is an American-made system, and we can deconstruct it. Anyway, I go off, but I'm going to go back to reading. Let's see here. Even now, the notion of a broad and supple middle class functions as a mighty bomb, a smokescreen. We cling to the comfort of the middle class, forgetting that there can't be a middle class without a lower. It is only occasionally shaken up, as when the Occupy Wall Street movement of recent years shone an embarrassing light on the financial sector and the grotesque separation between the 1% and the 99%. And then the media giants find new crises, and the nation's inherent disregard for class reboots on the as the subject recedes into the background again. As imaginary classless or class-free Americans past is the America that Charles Murray has conjured up in his book Coming Apart, The State of White America, 1960 to 2010. He published it in 2012. For Murray, an authority in the minds of many, the large and fluid society of 1963 was held together by the shared experience of the nuclear family. When they watched The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, average Americans believed they were seeing their lives on the small screen. Nothing could be further from the truth. Even in its innocent youth, televised caricatured people by class types. Only one need consider a few other popular shows of those halcyon years to prove the point. Petticoat Junction of 1963, which chronicled rural life at the shady Rest Hotel and contrasted the simpler people with their savvier city relations. The Farmer's Daughter, 1963, featuring a Swedish-American maid from the farm who goes to work for a U.S. congressman. Green Acres, 1965, where Arnold the Pig is the smartest resident of the social mobility, smartest resident of the hick town of Hooterville, and finally, that classic satire of social mobility, the Beverly Hillbillies, whose mountain-bred oil millionaires seem like evolutionary throwbacks in the eyes of city folk. And lest we forget, Ozzie and Harriet began its long run at the same time as The Honeymooners, a brilliant send-up of a bus driver, a sewer worker, and their poor working-class wives. Everyone who tuned in understood perfectly well that Ozzie and Harriet's world bore no resemblance to Ralph and Alice Cramden's parody, was one way Americans safely digested their class politics. Selective memory allows us to romanticize a golden age that functions as a timeless talisman of American identity. For Charles Murray, who ignores the country's long history, the golden age is 1963, when the essence of the American creed was somehow captured in a Gallup poll in which respondents refused to self-identify as either poor or rich. Approximately half said they were working class, while the other half perceived themselves as middle class. As if a single statistic could possibly tell a comprehensive story. The social scientist writes, those refusals reflected a national conceit that had prevailed from the beginning of the nation. America didn't have classes, or to the extent that it did, Americans should act as if we didn't. Right. Murray's fable of class denial can only exist by erasing a wealth of historical evidence that proves otherwise. The problem is, the evidence has never been effectively laid out, allowing gross misinterpretations to stand. By gaining first a better understanding of the colonial context and next charting the steps by which modern definitions of class were established, we will be able to see how ideas and ideals combined over time. By acknowledging the ongoing influence of older English definitions of poverty and class, we will come to recognize that class identity was apparent in America, profoundly so, long before George Gallup saw it as a creature of public opinion. Indeed, class resonated long before waves of immigrants swept ashore in the 19th century, and an awkward, often heated process of acculturation ensued. Above all, we must stop declaring what is patently untrue, that Americans, through some rare good fortune, escaped the burden of class that prevailed in the mother country of England. Far more than we choose to acknowledge, our relentless class system evolved out of recurring agrarian notions regarding the character and potential of the land, the value of labor, and critical concepts of breeding. Embarrassing lower-class populations have always been numerous and have always been seen on North American continent as waste people. Historical myth-making is made possible only by forgetting. We have to begin, then, with the first refusal to face reality. Most colonizing schemes that took root in the 17th and 18th century British America were built on privilege and subordination, not any kind of pro-democracy. The generation of 1776 certainly underplayed that fact, and all subsequent generations took their cue from the nation's founders. A past that relies exclusively on the storied Pilgrims or the sainted generation of 1776 shortchanges us in more ways than one. We miss a crucial historical competition between Northern and Southern founding narratives and their distinctive parables, minimizing the importance of class. The Declaration of Independence and the Federal Constitution, principal founding documents, loom large as proof of national paternity. The 6'3" Virginia George Washington stands head and shoulders above his countrymen as the figurative father of the nation. With Virginia's claim to origin story in mind, another founding father, John Adams, heralded the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, as an earlier and stronger model for an American patrician patriarch. The lesson is easy, then as now. Origins are contested territory. What can't be denied, however, are the class origins of the anointed leaders. Beyond the web of stories the founding generation itself wove, our modern beliefs have most to do with the grand mythmakers of the 19th century. The inspired historians of that period were nearly all New Englanders. They outpaced all others in shaping the historical narrative, so that the dominant story of origins worked in their favor. That is how we got the primordial Puritan narrative of a sentimental community and a commendable work ethic. Of course, the twin attributes of religious freedom and hard work erase the record from all those settlers who did not live up to those high ideals. The landless, impoverished, the progenitors of future generations of white trash conveniently disappear from the founding saga. There were plays and poems in addition to standard histories, flowing from the pens of Bostonians as they praised the separatists who established the early settlements. As early as 1769, New Englanders began celebrating Forefathers' Day in Plymouth, Boston artist Henry Sargent unveiling his painting Landing of the Fathers in 1815. But the first volume of George Bancroft's widely praised History of the United States in 1834 may be the best example of how the Mayflower and Arbella washed ashore and seeded the ground where love of liberty bore its ripest fruits in hubristic orations by the likes of Daniel Webster at well-attended 19th century anniversary celebrations. Let's see here. I just lost my place. These efforts were magnified as a result of promotional skills demonstrated by such organizations as the Colonial Dames, who worked to elevate Mayflower Pilgrims and Winthrop's Puritans in some of the foremost figures of our national memory. In 1889, the Pilgrim movement, known now as the National Monument to the Forefathers, the Pilgrim Monument, now known as the National Monument to the Forefathers, was dedicated at Plymouth, showing just how colossal the original plan was. The Boston architect and sculptor Hammett Billings submitted a design for a 150-foot monument which he conceived as the American version of the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It does not nullify his purpose that the final sculpture proved to be a smaller scale and predictably allegorical. A female figure of faith points to heaven and clutches a Bible, much like the Statue of Liberty with her torch. Monuments imperfectly record the past, as we all know. There is a strange discrepancy between the chiseled female form, which could appear almost anywhere, and the event being recalled. John Gast's famous 1872 painting, American Progress, has an ethereal female spirit flying above the pioneers' transcontinental migratory march west across the plains. Stagecoaches, wagons, railroad tracks, telephone lines push aside Indians and buffalo that stand in their way. Billings' statue also heralds faith, but lofts above the actual people on the Mayflower. The names appear less prominently on the side of the structure. Thus, the first English settlers' personal motives for making the journey have been subsumed into a singular, overwhelming force of religious liberty. The settlers remain mute. The complex process of colonization is condensed and forgotten because all human traces, the actual people tied to those names, are lost. There is no remembrance of those who failed, those without heirs or legacies. Instead, time has left subsequent generations with a hollow symbol, progress on the march. The compression of history, the winnowing of history, may seem natural and usual, but it is decidedly not. It is the means by which grade school history becomes our standard adult history, and so the Great American Saga, as taught, excludes the very pertinent fact that after the 1630s, less than half came to Massachusetts for religious reasons. The tall tales we unthinkingly absorb when young somehow remain within. The result is a narrowly conceived sense of national belonging, productive of the most uncompromising satisfying myths. American exceptionalism. We are unique and different, and the absence of class is one of our hallmarks. Exceptionalism emerges from a host of earlier myths of redemption and good intentions. Pilgrims persecuted in the Old World brave the Atlantic, dreaming of finding religious freedom on America's shores. Wagon trains of hopeful pioneer families head west to start a new life. Nowhere else, we are meant to understood, was personal freedom so treasured as it was in the American experience. The very act of migration claims to equalize the people involved, molding them into a homogeneous, effectively classless society. Stories of unity tamp down our discontents and mask even our most palpable divisions. It is not supposed to be important to our history. It is not who we are. Instead, we have the Pilgrims, a people who celebrated Thanksgiving, a holiday that did not exist until the Civil War. Who came ashore at Plymouth Rock, a place only designated as such in the late 18th century. The quintessential American holiday was associated with the native turkey to help promote the struggling poultry industry during the Civil War. The word pilgrim was not even popularized until 1794. Nevertheless, the first Thanksgiving has been given a date of 1621, when well-meaning pilgrims and fair-minded Wampanoags shared a meal. The master of ceremonies was their Indian interpreter, Squanto, who had helped the English survive a difficult winter. Left out of this story is the detail, not so minor, that Squanto only knew English because he'd been kidnapped and sold as a slave to an English ship's captain. Coerced labor of this kind reminds us of how the majority of white servants came to America. Squanto's friendship, alas, was a far more complicated affair than the fairy tale suggests. He died of a mysterious fever the very next year while engaged in a power struggle with Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag Confederation. In spite of the obvious stature of a Washington and a Jefferson and Virginia's settlement 13 years pre-Pilgrim, the southern states lagged behind the scribbling northerners in fashioning a comprehensive colonial myth to highlight their own cultural ascendancy in the New World. Here's what we have. less a story than a mystery. There persists this day a morbid curiosity about the 1587 lost colony of Roanoke, a puzzle on the order of Amelia Earhart's disappearance over the Pacific. A strange allure surrounds every vanishing people. Recall the wildly popular television series Lost, or Plato's Atlantis. Ghost ships and ghost colonies invoke a marvelous sense of timelessness. They exist outside the normal rules of history, which explains why Roanoke's mystery mitigates the harsh realities we instinctively know the early settlers were forced to face. All right. Let's see here. Virginia, I'm just skipping a little bit. Virginia was even less a place of hope. Here was England's rowdy and undisciplined, men willing to gamble their lives away but not ready to work for a living. England perceived them as manure for a marginal land. All these idle men understood was a cruel discipline when it was imposed upon them in the manner of the mercenary John Smith, and the last thing they wanted was to work to improve the land. All that would keep the fledgling colony alive was a military-style labor camp meant to protect England's interests in the country's ongoing competition with the equally designing Spanish, French, and Dutch governments. That a small fraction of colonists survived the first 20 years of the settlement came as no surprise back home, nor did London's elite much care. The investment was not in people. The colonists were... whose already unrefined habits declined. The investment was not in people whose already unrefined habits declined over time, whose rudeness magnified in relation to their brutal encounters with the Indians. The colonists were meant to find gold, to line the pockets of the investor class back in England. The people sent to accomplish this task were by definition expendable. So we now know what happens to our colonial history. It is whitewashed. Though New World settlers were supposed to represent the promise of social mobility, and the Pilgrims generated our hallowed faith in liberty, 19th century Americans paradoxically created a larger-than-life cast of democratic royalty. These inheritors founded the first genealogical societies in the 1840s, and by the turn of the 20th century, patriotic organizations with an emphasis on hereditary descent, such as the General Society of Mayflower Descendants and the Order of the Founders and Patriots of America, boasted chapters across the nation. The highly exclusive Order of the First Families of Virginia was established in 1912, its members claiming that their lineage could be traced back to the English lords and ladies, Rebecca Rolfe, whom we all know as the ennobled and anglicized Pocahontas. Statues are the companions of elite societies in celebrating paternal lineage and the new aristocracy. They tell us that some families and some classes have a greater claim as heirs on the founding promise. Municipal and state leaders have supported the national hagiography in bold form by constructing grand monuments to our colonial city fathers. The version of James Winthrop that the revolutionary John Adams had favored, dressed in Shakespearean or Tudor Stuart attire with an ornate ruff collar and hose, first graced the Back Bay of Boston in 1880. But the largest such memorial in a 27-ton statue of William Penn perched atop City Hall in Philadelphia. After it was completed in 1901, no structure in the entire city was permitted to be taller than Penn's Quaker hat until 1987, ensuring that the founder's sovereign gaze towered over the city of brotherly love, commemorating the colonizing act of territorial possession. In British law, ownership was measured by standing one's ground, that is, holding and occupying the land. Land itself was a source of civic identity. The principle explains, as well as the totem value of Plymouth Rock, the large stone discovered long after the last pilgrims breathed New England air, christened in the 18th century as the first piece of land on which the Mayflower settlers stood. Commemoration of this kind begs the following questions. Who were the winners and losers in the great game of colonial conquest? Beyond parceling the land, how were estates bounded, fortunes made, and labor secured? What social structures, what manner of social relationships did the first European Americans really set in motion? Finding answers to these questions will enable us to fully appreciate how long ago established identities of haves and have-nots left a permanent imprint on the collective American mind. Americans' sketchy understanding of the nation's colonial beginnings reflects the larger cultural impulse to forget, or at least to gloss over, centuries of dodgy decisions, dubious measures, and outright failures. The lost colony of Roanoke was just one of many unsuccessful colonial schemes. Ambitious-sounding plans for New World settlements were never more than ad hoc notions for overblown promotional tracts. The recruits for these projects did not necessarily share the belief of those principled leaders molded in bronze, and the John Winthrops and William Penns, who were lionized for having projected the enlarged destinies of their respective colonies. Most settlers in the 17th century did not envision their forced exile as the start of the city upon a hill. They did not express undying confidence in Penn's holy experiment. Dreamers dreamt, but few settlers came to America to fulfill any divine plan. During the 1600s, far from being ranked as valued British subject, the great majority of early colonists were classified as surplus population and expendable rubbish, a rude, rather robust population. The English subscribed to the idea that the poor dregs would be weeded out of English society in four ways. Either nature would reduce the burden of the poor through food shortages, starvation, and disease, or drawn into crime, they might end up on the gallows. Finally, some would be impressed by force or lured by bounties to fight and die in foreign wars, or else be shipped off to the colonies. Such worthless drones as these could be removed to colonial outposts that were in short supply of able-bodied laborers, unless we forget young, fruitful females. Once there, it was hoped the drones would be energized as worker bees. The bee was the favorite insect of the English, a creature seen as chaste but more important, highly productive. The colonists were a mixed lot. On the bottom of the heap were men and women of the poor and criminal classes. Among these unheroic transplants were roguish highwaymen, mean vagrants, Irish rebels, known whores, and an assortment of convicts shipped to the colonies for grand larceny or other property crimes as a reprieve of sorts to escape the gallows. Not much better were those who filled the ranks of indentured servants, who ranged in class position from lowly street urchins to former artisans burdened with overwhelming debt. They had taken a chance in the colonies, having been impressed into service and then choosing exile over possible incarceration within the walls of an overcrowded, disease-ridden English prison. Labor shortages led some ship captains and agents to round up children from the streets of London and other towns to sell to planters across the ocean. This was known as spiriting. Young children were shipped off for petty crimes. One such case was that of Elizabeth Little Bess Armstrong, sent to Virginia for stealing 2 spoons. Large numbers of poor adults and fatherless boys gave up their freedom, selling themselves into indentured servitude, whereby their passage was paid for in return for contracting to anywhere from 4 to 9 years of labor. Their contracts might be sold and often were upon their arrival. Unable to marry or choose another master, they could be punished or whipped at will. Owing to harsh working conditions they had to endure, one critic compared their lot to Egyptian bondage. Discharged soldiers, also of lower class, were shipped off to colonies. For a variety of reasons, single men and women and families of the lower gentry and those of artisan and human classes joined the mass migratory swarm. Some left their homes to evade debt that might well have landed them in prison. Others, a fair number coming from Germany and France, viewed the colonies as an asylum from persecution for their religious faith. Just as often, resettlement was their escape from economic restrictions imposed upon their trades. Still, others ventured to America to leave tarnished reputations and economic failures behind. As all students of history know, slaves eventually became one of the largest groups of unfreed laborers, transported from Africa and the Caribbean, and from there to the mainland British colonies. Their numbers grew to over 600,000 by the end of the 18th century. Africans were found in every colony, especially after the British government gave full encouragement to the slave trade when it granted an African monopoly to the Company of Royal Adventurers in 1663. The slave trade grew even faster after the monopoly ended, as American colonists bargained for lower prices and purchased slaves directly from foreign vendors. To put class back into the story where it belongs, we have to imagine a very different kind of landscape. Not a land of equal opportunity, but a much less appealing terrain where death and harsh labor conditions awaited most migrants. A firmly entrenched British ideology justified rigid class stations with no promise of social mobility. Certainly, Puritan religious faith did not displace class hierarchy either. The early generations of New Englanders did nothing to diminish the principal let alone condemn, the routine reliance on servants or slaves. Land was the principal source of wealth, and those without any had little chance to escape servitude. It was the stigma of landlessness that would leave its mark on white trash from this day forward. So welcome to America as it was. The year 1776 is a false starting point for any consideration of American conditions. Independence did not magically erase the British class system, nor did it root out long-entrenched belief about poverty and the willful exploitation of human labor. An unfavored population, widely thought of as waste or rubbish, remained disposable, indeed well into modern times. And I'm going to stop reading now because my throat and chest are getting a little tight and uncomfortable from reading for a while. But if you like it, if you're interested in reading this, that, like I said earlier, and you weren't here for it, Amar, do you face read? Do I face read? I don't know what that means. I'm sorry. Hi, I don't know what that means. Can you elaborate? Do I face read? I don't know. But if you're interested in this book, it's White Trash, the 400-Year Untold History of Class in America. It's written by Nancy Eisenberg, and it is a really great history for self-educating. If you are not a person of color, if you are a white person and you want to educate yourself to better deconstruct or understand how we need to deconstruct the systemic racism and classism that exists in our country, to understand how to deconstruct it, we have to understand how it was constructed. And this is a really great book for that. So that's why I was reading from this today. And I'll make a short clip with just a little tidbit on it and post it on my feed so that folks that missed the live today can check it out. Thank you guys for watching, and tap if you like, and follow me if you want to learn more about me, or come back again. Thanks. I hope you have a great day, guys. Love y'all. Bye.